Good morning. My name is Reverend Dr. Mae Elise Cannon. I'm the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. Many of you have joined us over the last couple of weeks as we have turned our eyes toward Jerusalem, toward Gaza, towards what's happening in Israel and in the Holy Land. And so we wanted to continue that conversation by tapping into the expertise of Israeli human rights experts, men and women who are committed to addressing human rights concerns in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. And so we have three esteemed guests: Tania Hary of Gisha, Rabbi Elhanan Miller of Rabbis for Human Rights, and Jessica Montell from HaMoked. And I'll introduce each of them in a little bit more detail. And the question I've asked them to start us out with is, give us a snapshot of what's happening right now. We know that, 2 weeks of violence between Hamas in Gaza and Israel resulted in the death of more than 200 in Gaza, including 60 children in 1 week, in more than a dozen deaths in Israel. We've been paying a lot of attention to what's happening to the displacement of families in Shakshara. So we have snapshots of human rights issues that are front and center at this moment. But the question that I've asked each of them to answer is, from your perspective, what are the core human rights issues you're working on at this moment? And we'll start with that current reality before we move on to talking about what are the things we can do in the US to advocate certainly for a just peace, but for human rights and equality for all in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. So we'll start with Tania. Tania is the Executive Director of Gisha, the Legal Center for Freedom of Movement. She's done many things with us at Churches for Middle East Peace, for which we're grateful. We have great respect for her work and for the work of Gisha. Prior to joining in 2007, she worked on advocacy and fundraising initiatives for nonprofit organizations, promoting human rights and development. She's relied upon as a source of information and analysis on the situation in Gaza by diplomats, foreign offices, and international organizations, and lectures regularly, including appearing before the Security Council in 2015. Tania, it's good to see you again. I'm sorry, I feel like we only talk when there's a major crisis in terms of some of the realities of what's happening, but with your work related to Gaza, we'd love an introduction of how you see things at this moment.
So thanks so much for hosting this conversation. It's always great to partner with Churches for Middle East Peace, and I'm glad to be here with my colleagues as well. It's a big question you're asking us to tackle in just a few minutes. So, I think what I'll start with, though, is to say to audiences who are watching, most likely in the United States, that, when things go quiet in the US, when things are seemingly not happening because they're not on your front pages of your newspapers or being talked about on the news, things are unfortunately not quiet in Gaza. It's really never quiet in Gaza. And that's a theme that we want to introduce because we want people to stay engaged, not only when there are escalations and these kind of dramatic eruptions of violence that bring the press to the region, but also in between, when really regular people are suffering the effects of an ongoing conflict, an ongoing political situation, which demands resolution. So Gisha means access or approach, and we focus on the issue of access because basically that's the main way that Israel maintains control over Gaza. We are an Israeli human rights organization and have been operating since 2005. And if you think about it, and I think all of us know this kind of in our souls much better now after the pandemic, movement and access is really key to everything else. It's leads to the right to life, to education, to family life, to economic livelihoods, health. It's really everything. And when it comes to movement and access to Gaza, as we know, movement has been restricted. It's been used as a form of pressure, even collective punishment, for political reasons beyond just basic security needs. And so we chose to focus on movement and access, both because it's everything and also because We know that it impacts all people. There are 2 million people living in Gaza. They're all impacted by movement restrictions, whether or not they are involved in hostilities. And of course, the vast majority of the population is not involved in hostilities. In Gaza, you have about 50% of the population under the age of 18. So we're talking about 1 million children, about 70% under the age of 30. So 1.4 million young people. Those are people who didn't vote in Palestinian elections, which took place in 2006 when Hamas came to power. They didn't vote also for Hamas to take over the Strip in 2007. And these are young people, of course, who need a future. So the way we do our work, the kind of day-to-day, is we're providing legal assistance and doing public advocacy to try to change movement and access restrictions specifically. In the wake of the escalation, which I'm sure your audiences know quite a bit about, what we're looking at these very days, the priorities for us are on reopening the crossings. So the pedestrian and commercial crossings with Israel remain mostly closed, even though a ceasefire was signed more than a week and a half ago. The fishing zone remains restricted to 6 nautical miles. And even if the fishermen could get out, they can't market their fish to the West Bank. So they're, literally don't have markets to sell to inside of the Strip enough. There's also restrictions on incoming goods. So raw materials can't go to the factories to produce locally. Goods can't be shipped abroad. Of course, construction materials are also not entering. Items that are needed for the water sector, for the repair of electricity infrastructure. So really our main priority right now is to just get those crossings open. And then I would say more broadly, our priority is to get people to realize that what's happening in Gaza is connected more broadly to the situation. I'm sure my colleagues will touch on other areas of the region, so I won't go into everything that's happening. But the main point that I would say is that what is happening in Gaza is very much part of a broader strategy by the Israeli government in our assessment of control, demographic control, territorial control, the idea of having the most land with the fewest Palestinians on it, and movement and access has been used as a tool as well in that political control of the region. So again, there's a lot we can go into, and I'll stop there for now.
Well, and I certainly have follow-up questions already. I'll allow your colleagues to speak first before we enter into discussion. For those who are joining us, this is a conversation about human rights issues in Israel and occupied Palestinian territories. And please put your questions in the chat. I know a few people have introduced themselves. We'd love to hear where you are. I'm coming from, I don't even know if the speakers know this, I'm on the West Coast in the land of the Salish peoples on a little island overlooking Vancouver Island. So I'm far away from DC and certainly far away from the Middle East, but really grateful for this conversation. So thank you, Tania, for that initial introduction. I'll go now to Jessica Montel. She's been a leading figure in Israeli civil society for 2 decades and serves as the executive director of HaMoked, an Israeli human rights and legal aid center. Jessica previously did pilgrimage to peace tours with Churches for Middle East Peace. And so I feel like whenever we've traveled across the United States together, it's quite a bonding experience. And you can see videos of that on the CMEP website. For 30 years since HaMoked's founding, HaMoked has provided free legal and paralegal assistance to over 100,000 Palestinians from the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. HaMoked also conducts strategic litigation to change Israeli government and military policy to better respect human rights. And when I first met Jessica, she was the executive director of B'Tselem, of whom I know many people are also familiar. So a long-standing voice in the human rights community. Jessica, from your perspective, based in Jerusalem and with the issues that you work on, what do we most need to know about the human rights conditions at this moment?
Thanks, Mae, and hello to everyone, and thanks to Churches for Middle East Peace for convening us. Our office in HaMoked is in Sheikh Jarrah, and so for the past month, we've seen, the escalation and the police response to the protests. And as Tania said, Often Israel-Palestine falls off the radar. It's not in the headlines, but that doesn't mean that the situation here is, improving or bearable for the Palestinian population living under occupation. And from our perspective here at HaMoked, occupation is not only these dramatic headline events, the terrible violence and destruction that we have seen over the past few weeks. Occupation, basically for the majority of Palestinians, is a permit bureaucracy. I mean, it sounds very mundane, but the fact that you need a permit from the Israeli military to go anywhere, even for a lot of people to live in their home, you need a permit from the military. All of this, bureaucracy that makes life unbearable for the majority of Palestinians. And I think that is what we need to make manifest and to be working to combat. A lot of our work, every morning we get phone calls from Palestinian parents whose children were arrested. And often you're talking about night arrests of minors in the middle of the night. That's, an ongoing nightly practice of the Israeli military. And then parents who don't even know where have their children been taken, how can they contact them, and all of the abuses that come with that. So, I think it's important, of course, to be focusing on, the police brutality that we have seen in Jerusalem and the West Bank, and hold Israel accountable for the bombing of, targeting, if there was targeting of civilian infrastructure, the really extensive deaths and injuries and destructions in Gaza from this fighting, but also not to lose sight of the basic, the basic structure of occupation. And I would just add, one of the things that is now the COVID-19 pandemic, which in Israel is basically finished because we had such a successful vaccine rollout. And still for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, they are still in, really the height of this pandemic. And I think this is such an excellent illustration in terms of Israel's evasion of its responsibility for the welfare of Palestinians. I mean, Israel that still controls all of the imports and exports in Gaza, and has legal responsibilities for the welfare of the population, not to mention that it just makes sense in terms of epidemiological considerations. Of course, all of us living in a single area, none of us are safe until all of us are safe. I mean, I think in that sense, we've all learned from coronavirus, it's a metaphor for, for all of the issues that should concern us on the planet. You have all of our organizations are part of a petition to Israel's High Court of Justice, demanding that Israel make the coronavirus vaccines available to the Palestinian population. And Israel has so far refused to do that. So there will be a hearing, I think it's the 14th of this month, on that High Court petition. But I think, again, it's of course, a really burning, life and death issue, the COVID-19 vaccines, but also, as I said, a metaphor for the broader issues of Israel's responsibility for the welfare of the Palestinian population and the way that it is failing to uphold that responsibility. I mean, that Israel is controlling everything. Certainly in the West Bank, and also such important factors in terms of Gaza, and yet wants to, have all of the benefits of that control with none of the responsibilities of that control. And I think that has to be the starting point for any conversations with Israel.
That's helpful. Certainly, before this recent escalation, we were paying significant attention to the realities of COVID. We've been advocating for the US government to release funds. There was $5 million from a humanitarian fund that went to one of our member organizations, Catholic Relief Services, that's doing incredible work in Gaza in response to the COVID crisis. And of course, when bombs are flying and rockets, we start paying attention to other things and ignore some of these issues that have not disappeared just because we're in the middle of crisis. So we will certainly talk more about that. But before we do, I'm pleased to meet and to introduce you to Rabbi Elhanan Miller, who's the head of the Department for Human Rights and a researcher. I see OPT, which I think is
occupied Palestinian territories.
I thought so, but it was all capital letters. And even though I work in Washington, D.C., am not the best at acronyms. But Rabbi Miller works with Rabbis for Human Rights, who we've known for a long time. And he's a researcher of Palestinian politics at the Forum for Regional Thinking. He's previously served as the rabbi of the Jewish community in Canberra, Australia, and the Arab Affairs correspondent for the Times of Israel. There's more of his bio, and I could go on and on. Quite accomplished. I heard prior to his joining this morning that he is known by many as the Arabic-speaking rabbi, and that he has these educational videos he does to teach Palestinians about Judaism, which I hear are quite popular. So your reputation precedes you, Rabbi Miller. I'm great to have you with us and eager to hear from your perspective as someone who is religious, but working for, of course, Rabbis for Human Rights that's paid significant attention to human rights issues. How do you see things?
Firstly, thanks for that kind introduction, Reverend Mae, and thanks for having me on this panel. It's good to be here. Rabbis for Human Rights is an Israeli human rights organization that was established in 1988 at the beginning of the first Intifada, and today deals with three main issues. One is poverty and housing issues within Israel, so social justice inside Israel. The second is education, especially in gap year programs and academies that prepare young Israelis for military service. That's a very popular pastime or gap year program in Israel around issues of human rights, as well as interreligious work. And my department, the OPT, or Occupied Palestinian Territories Department, deals primarily with human rights violations of Palestinians in the West Bank. So less so Gaza, but more what's happening in the West Bank. I think in the last round of violence, we've seen a sharp increase in attacks by settlers in and around the communities that we volunteer with and work with and have been working with for a long time. I visited, for example, the village of Burin just last week. Burin is a small Palestinian rural agricultural community just south of Nablus, where homes near one of the illegal outposts have been attacked repeatedly. Farmers have been attacked. Olive trees have been burned. Fields have been burned. So I think all of our sights have been fixed more on Gaza, obviously, because that's where most of the fighting was going on. Our sights were also fixed on the intra-Israeli violence between Jews and Arabs inside what's known as the mixed cities, which actually most Israeli cities are mixed to some extent, but there were certain cities that were hotspots for violence, and a lot of the attention was there. Less attention was given to the attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank. I think that was given the least attention, at least in the media, in this last round, and that's where our activity is focused. So for most of our organization's history, we volunteer helping farmers harvest their olives in the olive harvest season. And now we've been focusing or switching our focus more to the Jordan Valley area, which is a huge, vast part of the West Bank, sparsely populated and mostly populated by Bedouins and shepherds, Palestinian shepherds. And a lot of the violence is moving, sort of seeping down from the hilltops of Samaria and the West Bank, sort of into the valley, where these shepherds are being harassed and blocked from shepherding in their pastures. This is part of sort of a grander scheme, a sort of strategic I'd say, plan to quietly annex what's known as Area C of the West Bank, which makes up 60% of the West Bank and is the area in and around the Israeli settlements. So the settlements themselves and the open areas around them are known as Area C under the Oslo peace process. And the man who might be very likely to be our next prime minister, we'll know in a few hours probably whether he is or isn't, Naftali Bennett, is the politician who probably produced one of the only peace plans coming out of the right, or solutions coming out of the right. And the big strategy of that, and probably of other parties on the Israeli right, is to annex Area C of the West Bank, that 60% of the West Bank, and leave the Palestinians in these separate enclaves in and around the cities of the West Bank, the Palestinian cities that have already been evacuated from the Israeli army has evacuated them in the 90s, and they're already where the Palestinian Authority rules. So the fight, the struggle today in terms of land grabs is focused on these open areas, Area C. So that's where we're seeing now a lot of settlement activity, but also a lot of attacks and these sort of semi-official attempts to push the Palestinians away from the open rural areas into cities and communities. We see this in the south as well, in the Hebron area, as well as in the Jordan Valley and in the north. So that's where the focus is today. Speaking politically, we might have a new government in a few hours, but that government by no means will be a peace government. If anything, it'll be a political stagnation government with very strong elements of the right. Certainly as prime minister in the first round, in the first few years, it will likely be Naftali Bennett, who's an ideological right-wing politician. So that's sort of an overview of what we do and of the activity of my department, and I'm happy to answer more questions when you ask them. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And I would encourage people who are watching, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. Before I move on to the next kind of segment that I wanted us to talk about for a minute, Rabbi Miller, just in terms of speaking about the possibilities of Naftali Bennett in forming this coalition government and becoming the next prime minister of Israel, how realistic is it that annexation of Area C is imminent on the horizon? I mean, you mentioned that Churches for Middle East Peace has been committed to a campaign. We use the hashtag Churches Against Annexation. I mean, should we be mobilizing now in that regard? Are we feeling like this is imminent? Are things still unstable enough in terms of, who will be next in line in terms of the politics?
Well, I mean, there are two options right now that seem most likely. One is this alternative government that seems to be the more likely option where we stand right now, or another round of elections. Netanyahu doesn't seem to have the political power to form a government. In either way, whether with Netanyahu or with Bennett, I don't think official annexation is on the cards right now. So that's not something that I would push for. If you're lobbying your congressmen or speaking to politicians, that wouldn't be the main concern. It's not a diplomatic concern. It's a concern revolving around human rights and activity on the ground, non-official activity, or activity that's at least not spoken about, that could be, taken within departments, government departments, ministries, to push the Palestinians further and further away from independence by expanding settlement activity, especially in remote areas that can't realistically be annexed under a peace plan, because under all the viable peace plans that we've seen come out, there have been settlement blocks that were spoken about as that are close to the 67 lines that could, I guess, theoretically be annexed to Israel in return for land swaps. That's what most plans spoke about, but what we're seeing on the ground is sort of what's called as a euphemism, single farming communities or young settlement activity. There's different euphemisms and names for it. But what it is essentially individuals setting up farms, usually illegally, and then being legalized later on in remote hilltops that are a few kilometers or miles away from the nearest settlement, And those people sometimes have herds, they have farming activity, they bring in sort of wayward youth that hasn't found its place in school to dominate and to shepherd these herds, and they basically grab huge areas of land. And that's what's happening in practice. And this land grab pushes the Palestinians further away from their communities. And I've actually heard an officer just say this to us in one of our volunteer activities when I was out there with one of the shepherds. He said, well, why don't these shepherds just move to Jericho? So they're 5 miles away from Jericho shepherding. And she's like, yeah, the plan basically is, that's not spoken about, right? No one will ever announce this, but why don't, if he doesn't want to live near a firing zone or near, an area that a settler set up, then why doesn't he just move to Jericho and, become, a city dweller instead of a farmer, right? So that's where the issues are. There's also other issues such as water distribution, which is a huge issue. But unfortunately, those are a bit harder to tackle because they're part of the Oslo peace agreements. So the Palestinians don't get a fair share of water under the Oslo peace accords. I think it's a little less realistic to open those accords now, but certainly in lobbying and in speaking to your politicians, there's a lot that can be done, especially around the issues of these disparate sort of communities that are being legitimized by the government.
That's helpful. We talk often about opposing not only political annexation, but the de facto annexation that's happening even as the political process may be separate. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about next is, we agree with you as human rights organizations. The issues that you're raising are things that CMEP cares about deeply in terms of equality for all within Israel. And then, of course, calling for an end to the occupation of the Palestinian people. But we work with a number of people in the US and have relationships with conservative churches or members of the Jewish community that would not agree with us, that a human rights lens is the most appropriate. I just had a conversation with a rabbi, a conservative rabbi in the US context, and we were talking about human rights, and the comment was that the things that I was saying about the treatment of Palestinians couldn't be true because they have relationships with people within Israel who don't believe them to be true, which brings me to, you were all based in Israel, brings me to the perception of human rights within Israeli society. But I'm sure we have American Jews who are watching this, and I'm sure that we have, members of the, not members, but American Christians who would say, everything you're saying is one-sided. It can't be that bad, or there's reasons why they would not agree with your framing. And so, Jessica, I'll start with you in that regard. But I think it's important for us to talk about that. We're honing in on very specific human rights concerns, like the treatment of Palestinian children. And an argument for why children need to be arrested in the middle of the night is because Israeli soldiers would die and there would be more violence if Israeli soldiers were going into the OPT, into the West Bank during the day. There's reasons for all of these things we're talking about. So delve into that question a bit, if you would.
Yes, I think you are right that what seems very clear to us and obvious is not obvious, not to a lot of people in the United States, supporters of Israel, and also to a lot of Israelis. And that is because the occupation is invisible to most Israelis. Again, when you don't have rockets flying, then it's completely off the radar. We had 4 rounds of elections, and the fact that the Israeli democracy is ruling over millions of people who are not part of that democracy, that issue was not on the agenda in any of the elections by almost any of the political parties running. So it's right there. I can walk, from my home to occupied West Bank. I can walk there in not very long, and yet it is completely invisible to Israelis. And then Israelis don't know what the reality is for Palestinians. Even Israelis who live in the West Bank, are theoretically governed, are living under military rule. Israeli Jews don't feel military rule. The settlements look and feel like Israeli communities. You have this whole legal mechanism so that 2 populations living side by side are governed by 2 completely different legal systems. And that enables us Israelis to continue living a very comfortable life, even those Israelis who are living in the middle of occupation and not feel occupation. So I think it's a challenge for all of us, how we have that conversation, how you bring that reality to the attention of Israelis, how we make Israelis understand occupation is, toxic not only for Palestinians, it's toxic for the Israeli democracy. And I think a lot of the phenomena that we are witnessing now, I mean, Israel is facing a wave of incitement and violence and extremism from Jewish Israelis. When you see, Naftali Bennett from the ultra-nationalist right now has police protection, a super elevated level of police protection from other ultra-right religious extremists who are willing to engage in violence to prevent what they see as being a dangerous government coming into play. I mean, it is in many ways evocative of the response of the previous president of the United States to the idea that, a different administration could, and also this war of narratives of what people believe to be true in spite of evidence, in spite of the facts. So, I mean, that argument that, occupation is terrible primarily for Palestinians, that Palestinians have basic rights. And I think, the conversation both with Israelis and with Americans, this basic premise that every human being is entitled to the same basic rights, that we all want for our families, the same basic things, dignity, security, freedom. I think that has to be the starting point, and to recognize that basic humanity for Palestinians. I mean, it should be obvious, but unfortunately is not obvious. That basic statement that Palestinian mothers and fathers want the same things for their children that I want for my children, that, that we all want. So that idea, number one, and the other idea that occupation is actually an existential threat to Israel. I mean, people who want Israel to be a democracy, people who are worried about incitement and violence and extremism inside Israel have to understand that, the idea that we can live side by side, Israeli democracy and Israeli military occupation, and our democracy won't be corrupted. I think we see very clearly the way, I mean, you look at the past month, the way the Israeli police have dealt with protests inside Israel. It's, it's the tactics of occupation that are infiltrating the Israeli democracy. And I would hope that that would be a warning light for Israelis and for everyone who cares about Israel to understand that occupation is a danger and a threat to all of us.
As you were speaking, it makes me think of a quote that we often keep in mind from our friend from Jerusalem, the Israeli attorney, Danny Seideman, says often, Israelis in Tel Aviv are sipping cappuccino while sitting on the edge of a volcano, in terms of the lack of awareness of what's happening in the occupied Palestinian territories. That's his quote, not mine, but that's what that makes me think of. Tania, you are featured on our CMEP video, and one of the things that is recorded in that introduction to our work at Churches for Middle East Peace is you talking about rocket fire from Gaza and how Israelis experience that and how it provokes fear. And so talk to us a bit, same question as I asked Jessica in terms of perceptions, but we hear 3,000 rockets, were fired into Israel during the recent escalations. And I hear things when we talk about the 60 children that were killed in this recent conflict that are in Gaza. Well, that's the fault of Hamas because Hamas has, weapons in schools. And so the death of children and the death of civilians is really the responsibility of Hamas because it's a terrorist organization. These are arguments and things that we hear often. So from your perspective, how receptive are Israelis to the realities of human rights that you're talking about? But help us understand also in the framing of, 3,000 rockets is a terrible thing. Is that the same as the bombing that's happening into Gaza? Help us understand those realities a bit more.
Okay, we'll do my best. I think that one of the things that came out of the recent escalation, kind of the discourse around what was happening, and just to say, I'm a really optimistic person, so I'm always kind of grabbing at things that look to me like a sign of light. So I always say that makes me a really terrible analyst. Like, I don't think I can really be relied upon, and unless you want to join me in this optimistic kind of view of things. I think that one of the things, though, that was positive that came out of this horrible escalation was a discussion about the word conflict. And is that an accurate word to describe what's happening here? And I think that certainly there are hostilities, there are rockets that are fired, there is use of violence by Palestinian armed factions. So I think that questions about the laws of war are certainly relevant, but I do think that, when you take a look at the broader picture and the broader context, we're not talking about equal sides to a conflict. We're not talking about two states. We're not talking about equal powers. We are talking about a people who are under occupation, who are fighting in many ways for liberation. And I do think that both for Israeli armed, the army and Navy and all of the factions of the army, as well as Palestinian armed groups, there are rules of how you fight, and there are red lines even in war. And so I do think that even if Hamas or other groups were using certain areas of Gaza, this is not necessarily a green light for the massive use of force that was applied in the targeting of civilian infrastructure and civilian buildings in Gaza. So I would want to say that. But back to the issue of this kind of false equivalence, I do think that it's really relevant in Israeli society, because Israelis are very much convinced that we're in a conflict with Palestinians. And there's us and there's them, and it's very much zero sum. And going back to the metaphor that Jessica used for the coronavirus, like, none of us can be safe until we're all safe, right? And I think that that's something that is not discussed enough with the Israeli public. They see it as a kind of battle of survival. And so, if I have to choose between my children and your children, I'm sorry, I'm going to choose my children. And I think that we have a lot of work to do to take apart that false equivalence, to take apart this concept of a zero sum, to very much elevate the fact that we're all here, we're all stuck in this region, and we have to find a way to live together. And I would say the final thing, and that's, I think, our role as human rights organizations, is to talk more about the question of responsibility and accountability. I started with discussing, the many ways that Israel still has control inside of Gaza, and that, that's not just a kind of wonky way of describing policy. I mean, it is very much connected to the way we think about Gaza and the way we think about Israel's relationship with Gaza. I've heard spokespeople say all of the time, the US wouldn't tolerate it if Mexico were firing rockets. Israel and Gaza are not US and Mexico by any means or stretch of the imagination. Israel still has such extensive control over so many aspects of life in Gaza and over the lives of civilians, and it therefore owes obligations to those civilians based on that control. So I think that those kind of three parts or strategies are very much things that I know that we're all working on, but I think, that's the big job that we have to do.
Well, and we're grateful for each of you and your respective work within Israeli society. And we're getting some questions about that, which we'll move to in just a minute. This is my last question as a facilitator before we open it up to the questions that we've been receiving. And this is for you, Rabbi Miller. Can you help us understand the role of religion in perceptions of the conflict? I mean, I mentioned in our context, you know, the United States is very partisan, probably more partisan at this moment in history than certainly any other time in my lifetime. And in that, you often have I'm ordained, for example, as an evangelical, and the vast majority of evangelicals in the United States would not agree with me about my perceptions of human rights in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. And so from your vantage point as a rabbi, help us understand the role of religion. We don't believe this is a religious conflict, but we believe that religious actors are very engaged and religious ideologies contribute. What do we need to know and understand about that? And are there divisions within, of course, Judaism within Israel in terms of perceptions of the conflict? Sorry, Tania said we shouldn't call it a conflict. I have to, of the hostilities.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. First, let me just say one more word about the organization. Our membership is made up solely of rabbis and rabbinical students across all denominations of Judaism. So there's 120 members who are rabbis, only Israelis. So it's a local Israeli organization. I myself am ordained as an Orthodox rabbi, a modern Orthodox rabbi. And to my great chagrin and sadness, a lot of the hate speech and the, I would say, incitement and racism coming out today are coming from Orthodox rabbis and leaders in the political arena. And actually, that's one issue that we as an organization are going to probably start tackling more and more now is hate speech, monitoring that type of religious hate speech and also responding to it with religious language. And we've been doing that already. In the last round, we issued a statement, a letter calling on religious leaders to try to quiet down spirits and restrain their communities, because in the cities themselves, a lot of the people inciting the violence were unfortunately rabbis, also imams in some cases, and religious politicians, more on the Jewish side and more on the Israeli side, unfortunately. But also on the other side. It's not, I agree with you, it's not a religious conflict in its essence. It's a conflict over territory, over distribution of land and rights, and a power struggle. But the religious language is very potent and it mobilizes people. And obviously Al-Aqsa is always used as sort of a calling cry, right, on the Palestinian side. And it's not usually Al-Aqsa specifically that is the problem. It's not the compound, although there are difficulties on Temple Mount, as we call it, or on Al-Aqsa compound. But usually that's a code word for something's happening in Jerusalem, right? So Sheikh Jarrah and the issue of land ownership and housing ownership, these settlements, these sort of micro settlements, and purchasing of houses by settler groups guarded by security companies funded by the Israeli government in the heart of Arab East Jerusalem. So they use Al-Aqsa sort of as a cry, but it's only a mobilizing force. Sort of, it's a code word for something's happening. Another example of our rabbinic sort of voice, because that's mostly what we come with. It's sort of the moral, I would almost say prophetic sort of language that we bring with us to the debate. We spoke also about the vaccinations in Gaza and the need to vaccinate the Palestinians there as the vaccines were being rolled out here. So that's our main tool. I mean, beyond the volunteers we have who aren't rabbis, right, who are just regular Israelis who want to take part in our activities, that's mostly what we have. And I've been trying myself in the interviews I've been giving on Arabic TV to talk about the role of religious leadership in calming things down and highlighting the verses and the traditions that we have, both in Judaism and in Islam, that call for peace, that call for justice, that call for recognition of the other as a human before, his religious affiliation. So that's kind of the language that we have and that we bring to the table of human rights organizations, each with its own specialty.
There's so much work to be done in that arena, in terms of education, in terms of returning to our sacred texts. We sometimes engage in a practice that's called scriptural reasoning, of looking at the sacred texts of Jews, Muslims, and Christians and seeking to better understand one another, by reading what the texts have to say about peace and about justice, and many of the core foundational ideologies that we think should be frameworks in terms of addressing many of the issues we're talking about today. Well, our time, we have just about 10 minutes or so left before we close. I know we've had some questions come in that have already been answered in the question and answer area, and others in the chat. I'll return to some of those, and then it's up for grabs in terms of who wants to respond. But Paul Welch from Syracuse, New York, asked the question of, there are 130 outposts that were not officially legal by Israel. Have they now become legal? And the question about outposts referring to settlements in the West Bank, what the status of those might be.
So maybe I'll take that quickly and then let my colleagues answer the other ones. No, they have not been officially recognized. These outposts are illegal under Israeli law. So unlike some settlements that have become legalized, usually they start out not illegal, and then they grow and they get infrastructure, like they get illegally connected to the electric grid and to the water grid, and then years down the line they become legalized. That's usually the process by which that happens. So these 130 outposts are not, mostly, some of them have gone through a process, but mostly are not legal. But that doesn't mean that de facto they're not getting the infrastructure that other Israelis are getting in a gradual process through government ministries and departments.
That's helpful. Thank you. John Kleinhexel asked the question of, there's signs the unrest has unified, especially Palestinian youth, in working toward human rights. What signs do you see of this, and will it impact the defunct Palestinian leadership?
So maybe I jump in from a slightly different perspective. I mean, I think the question of hope or hopelessness that we all are wrestling with in terms of the situation here, the possibility of making change, which often seems very remote. And then, the chronology of really a grassroots resistance to police measures around the old city of Jerusalem, the threatened evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. You had a very surprising and unique response of Jerusalemites, of a lot of young people, to be protesting and resisting. And then you had Hamas firing rockets, also as a response, justified as a response to those actions in Jerusalem. And I think, the question is what Palestinians learn and what we all learn from that chain of events. And I think it's in all of our interest that the response to that nonviolence, that resistance, that protest, that organizing can be a source of hope, that people that could be effective. On just the day after the ceasefire, on my way to work, I passed the Jerusalem District Court, which is just down the road from my office. And there was a hearing taking place in the court about another neighborhood in Jerusalem where Palestinians are facing eviction, in Silwan. There was a hearing about settlers taking over homes in Silwan. And outside the court, you had young Palestinian men and women demonstrating against those evictions, holding signs in Arabic against the evictions. And for me, it was, such a source of optimism that Palestinians see, both the Israeli courts as a potential form of activism to be resisting those evictions, and protest outside the court. That I said, I wish that those two forms of activism would be effective, that we all learn that those are ways that we can be pursuing justice, because the alternative is horrible, that, it can't be that violence is the only way that people can be pursuing justice. And maybe that links to one of the questions that someone posed about the Israeli courts. HaMoked is using litigation as one of our main strategies, both for individual redress for Palestinians, but also strategic litigation to be trying to make change. And it definitely is the case that the courts have gotten more and more hostile with the appointment of judges, that are ideologically opposed to our message. And I think, the sticking point right now about a new government is who's going to be appointing the next round of judges. And a big concern, you have Gidon Sar, who is supposed to be the next justice minister, more ideologically extreme and dangerous to my mind than Benjamin Netanyahu. And Ayelet Shaked, who served as justice minister, also very extremist ideologue, who is insisting that she also be on that committee to appoint judges. So, that is a big source of concern. There's nothing to celebrate, if the new government, is going to be appointing more and more judges hostile to our message. But the good news, and I, like Tania, am always looking for the silver lining. It remains the case, and it is surprising whenever I say to people, a majority of HaMoked cases are resolved successfully. Both the individual cases, people trying to get access to their land, people trying to get a residency permit to stay in their home, but also the systemic change, the strategic litigation that we are conducting in a majority of cases are successful. So I think, still there is hope for this sort of organizing on the ground, but maybe since our time is up almost, I say what I have learned about what makes advocacy successful, when you're talking about the strategic issues, the fact that there is international advocacy combined with litigation in Israeli courts, that's the magic formula for making change on human rights. It's not going to end the occupation. It's not going to dismantle settlements. I don't know if it can end the siege on Gaza, but to be pushing back against Israeli policies that violate human rights. In the past, every significant success has always been a combination of litigation in Israeli courts with international advocacy. So really, it's a partnership of us with you that is the only hope for making change.
Thank you for that, Jessica. And I love that you turned us to not only what people are doing in terms of affecting change in Shakshara and, in response to other specific issues in the OPT, but what we can do and how we can engage constructively. And in that regard, I'll just ask, this is the last question. I'll point it to you, Tania, and then Rabbi Miller will give you the last word to give us some hope before we close. So all of that in just the next 5 minutes. But we got a couple of questions about if Israeli youth protest for human rights alongside of Palestinian youth. My understanding is limitedly that there certainly are incredible Israeli human rights activists, but that they would be the exception to the rule rather than broader society. And I'm going to just take a moment. Louis Frankenthaler wrote a question connected to my ordination as an evangelical and said that there's indications that evangelical young people are becoming less committed to the unquestioning support of Israel, characteristic of their elders. How does this play into, if true, the way that discourse and actions concerning Israel-Palestine ending the occupation can change? And I'm going to tie that into the question I want to pose to you, Tania, this is from Paul Parker, who said, the vitriol, hate speech, and violence from many Israeli Jews is overwhelming. It seems that there's no hope for peace, for equal rights, for all people from the river to the sea. International activism and Palestinian initiatives will not succeed until Israeli Jews change. So what needs to happen for Israeli Jews to change? I'll just say for a moment, in terms of the evangelical context, people often criticize us across the spectrum, the theological spectrum, the spectrum from conservative to liberal. We're often criticized for being too empathetic to the Palestinian struggle. We're criticized for not being empathetic enough. But the work that we're doing fundamentally returns us to something I heard you say, Tania, of the concern for Palestinian children and the concern for Israeli children, that we believe the occupation is a threat to Jews in Israel, just in different ways, but that it still has detrimental effects on Jewish Israelis and of course on the Palestinians who live under occupation. And so our goal is to not turn people away from being supportive of Israel, but to encourage them to address human rights, to address real concerns so that Israel can be the democracy that she claims to be, where Palestinian citizens have equal rights, where Palestinians, certainly are not living under occupation or siege as in Gaza. So that would be my response to the question about evangelicals. What would be your response in terms of what needs to happen for Israeli Jews?
I mean, I agree very much with Jessica that, everything sort of needs to happen at once. I don't think that we can really isolate and say nothing is going to change until X changes. I think that each of us from where we're standing and in our positions needs to be sort of pushing. Picture it like we're all sort of chipping away at a wall and the cracks connect at some point, or that's what we hope. And until then, all we know how to do is kind of keep chipping away. So I don't think that we should lose hope. I think certainly, again, like I said, we have a lot of work to do. It's an uphill battle. We need to support one another. We need to make sure that people don't lose hope and don't lose, allow the cynicism to kind of overwhelm them. But I do want to say, because, this audience is in the United States, I think that the role of the United States is obviously very, very important. And connecting to the recent escalation, I was watching, I'm an American citizen, as you can hear from my accent. I was watching as the Biden administration struggled to kind of spit out the word ceasefire, maybe on the 10th day of the hostilities. And to let you know, I was watching the news here every night, and almost every night we would hear Netanyahu and others say, we have the US behind us. And it didn't matter if the whole world was, quote unquote, against us. As long as we had the US with us, we were going to keep going. And so I really think that the role of the United States here is huge. Israelis care what the United States does and says. They care what Americans are saying. And I do think that they're seeing that there are changes happening within the Democratic Party, but not just, among young people in the US. And I think that that is positive. And I want to believe that, Israelis will come along. So I think we're doing our work here. Please continue to do your work there. And those cracks are going to connect, and we can only hope that it'll come soon.
That's a wonderful word of hope. Thank you. We've been pointing people, they've been asking where they can find a copy of this video. It will be available on our Facebook page, on our YouTube page. We'll tag all of your respective organizations and want to point people to your website and resources as well. We currently have an action alert responding to the evictions in Shakshara specifically that is linked to in the chat. And we'd encourage people to sign up for CMEP's newsletter to stay engaged with us as we continue to have conversations like this. But as we close, Rabbi Miller, a word of hope from you in Israel.
Yeah, there's actually much more hope than sometimes people seem to glean from watching the news overseas. And my hope comes from things I see actually inside Israel. One example is on the grassroots level, and one example is on the political level. So on the grassroots level, there have been amazing initiatives of cooperation between Jews and Arab citizens of Israel. One notable example is a group called Standing Together, which has been organizing protests across the country, some of them reaching thousands of people. And it really is Jews and Arabs standing together. There's other grassroots groups. One of them we joined as an organization, and other organizations called Women Wage Peace, which is a women's-led grassroots organization, again, Jewish and Arab. So that's on the grassroots level. Also, there are cultural things happening. Many more Israelis are learning Arabic or showing an interest in learning Arabic. One Israeli group is now pushing that as legislation or to introduce it to schools. And these are processes that take time, but I'm a big believer in language as a tool for change. I myself taught Arabic and teach Arabic, so I believe in that. On the political level, and now this is still an open question, but if this government materializes, and we know that we'll know this in a few hours, this will be an example of how bipartisanship can dislodge a prime minister that some people thought would be here forever. Now, we don't know what the agenda of this government will be. It probably won't do that much, and it probably won't last to term for 4 years. But for the first time in a long time, maybe in history, you will have an Arab party, an Islamic party even, sitting in government or in some sort of role supporting the government with the farthest right-wing parties in Israel. And if that functions even for a while, it's baby steps. That will be a huge indicator of the ability to cooperate across political, but even across national or ethnic lines within Israel. And I think that would be a huge benefit. And I'm encouraged not by everything that the leader of the Islamic Party, Mansour Abbas, has said, but his rhetoric throughout this crisis and on TV has been very inspirational. Yes, he's problematic on certain issues like LGBT issues and other things that we're concerned about, but I think there could be some force for change here, so I'm optimistic.
That's a good word. The subtitle of my first book is called Small Steps for a Better World. And so my hope and prayer is that we might take some of those small steps together. And we don't know when things will shift on the horizon. So we hold on to the hope that your efforts and our efforts will bring about effective change for equality and justice and peace for all people in Israel and Palestine. So grateful to each of you, to your organizations. Please let us know when you're in Washington, D.C. We'd love to take you around Capitol Hill. If you're courageous, as Jessica was, and want to travel with us in the U.S. To see some of our churches, we'd be very open, of course, to traveling with you and working alongside of you. We're really grateful for your efforts. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Take care. Thank you.